Welcome to this meeting of the Canada-U.S. Relation Committee. For those who don't know me, my name is Guy Ouellet in French, and I represent the riding of Chamonix, just north of Blatchford, north of Montreal. And I'm a member of National Assembly of Quebec. Even though I can wait to see you all in person, I'm happy to be able to speak with you today. Even though we can still not shake hands, we need to keep our relations alive, and this is a great way to do it. First of all, let me salute my colleague Joël Boutin, who represents the riding of Jean Talon in our capital city, Quebec, and he is attending his first annual CSGE assembly. I'll not take too much of our time, and we have an interesting agenda lineup for us today under the theme Changing Times, the Canada-U.S. relationship in Biden administration. I'm sure our two speakers, Andy Blatchford from Politico and Ted Alden from the Council on Foreign Relations, will have some great insight for us. I'm especially interested in hearing their perspective on the evolving relationship between and provinces. As we all know, Canada has just reopened its border to fully vaccinated Americans on August 9, and after more than 17 months of closure. The U.S. federal government has not reciprocated yet, but hopefully it will soon be the case. Border management is an exclusive federal jurisdiction, but states and provinces can still have an influence. Without spoiling anything, I will announce right away that I will be proposing a resolution to that effect later in the meeting. I think we can all agree that the pandemic has made Canada-U.S. relations more complicated in recent time, as much on economic, social, and cultural side. And I think it's safe to say that a lot of us will be happy to grab a coffee with our friend across the border as soon as possible. So I think this committee will be a great forum to call on our federal counterpart to make it easier for vaccinated people to travel with due respect for all safety measures, of course. So again, welcome everyone. And before we turn over to our speaker, I will let my co-chair and friend, Billy Jones, to say a few words and let everyone introduce themselves. Billy.
Thank you, Guy, and it's great to be here with all of you, and I look forward to having that coffee with our friends and neighbors to the north, hopefully sooner than later. And Guy did touch on it. I am Billy Jones. I'm an assembly member of the New York State Assembly here in New York. Not much going on in New York politics as of late, but anywho, I'm from the northern Plattsburgh region. I know many of you on this call, and we were discussing it before everyone got on, or maybe while you were getting on, how we've transformed the region through partnerships with Canada. And I see a few of our economic developers on the phone or on the meeting here. Mr. Douglas from the North Country Chamber of Commerce, and how we've redeveloped this area after the base closure. And we were talking about that with some of our counterparts. But a big part of this and a big part of our economy and our culture and our familial ties here has to deal with our friends and neighbors to the north. And as my counterpart and co-chair Guy Ouellet had mentioned, we will be putting forth a resolution later in the program to encourage, strongly encourage our federal representatives, our federal administration on the American side to reciprocate what our Canadian partners have done, and also maybe make it even easier for border crossings to happen with fully vaccinated people and safely done. I believe that we can do this now, and just wanted to make that introduction. Look forward to a good program with our speakers as well. And I guess I'm up introducing one of our speakers, David. Also want to say thank you to David Biet and the staff of CSG East for putting this together and having a great week of informative meetings. And it's great to see all my counterparts from both sides of the border. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to be here. But without further ado, I will introduce Andy Blatchford. Andy Blatchford is a reporter for Politico covering Canada, Politico's first Canadian-based journalist. He focuses on U.S.-Canada relationships, including the economic ties, the political links, and the 5,525-mile border. Before Politico, he spent nearly 13 years with the Canadian Press. He won a Team National Newspaper Award for their breaking news coverage of the fatal Parliament Hill shooting in October of 2014. And without further ado, it's my honor to introduce Andy Blatchford for a great discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it's great. Thanks for having me. It's great to do this. It's really interesting, obviously, topic. I was going to dive into three key themes right now of the U.S.-Canada relationship. And of course, as you've both sort of set up nicely, the state of Canada's border reopening. I'm going to focus a little more on the Canadian side, and I think Edward is going to talk a little bit about the U.S. side afterwards. But so as you know, the U.S. and Canada put COVID border restrictions in place back in March 2020. And now recently, Canada's reopened to fully vaccinated Americans just on August 9th. So the restrictions have prevented Americans from entering the country since the start of the pandemic. And now that they've started to be lifted, we've heard about border delays, as guards conduct more COVID screening and ask more questions to travelers. There's a lot more sort of work to do at the borders right now for each individual person hoping to cross. The Canadian border from here is scheduled to reopen to fully vaccinated people from other parts of the world on September 7th as part of Canada's gradual border reopening. An interesting angle to this is that the US and Canada committed back in February to reopening the border in a coordinated approach. Both President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau outlined this in their roadmap to the relationship. So there's been some focus on that and whether this is truly coordinated with the United States still land crossing still closed to Canadians, non-essential Canadian travelers. But as you know, the US, as I said, is keeping its borders closed to non-essential travelers for now. And Canadians, even the unvaccinated, have been permitted to fly into the US throughout the pandemic. But the land crossings have been a different story. And next deadline for the border restrictions is August 21st, which is Saturday. So, will the Biden administration start lifting restrictions at the land crossings? We'll see. But so far, we haven't seen any signals that it's willing to do that. It feels like it's going to be even longer. We'll see. With the closures, I think as many of you know, business leaders and border watchers have also described the way the governments closed the borders and perhaps that it was too sweeping and too sort of strong, I guess, across the entire frontier. And now there's pressure on both sides to find ways to ensure the same thing doesn't happen in any future crisis. So we'll have to wait and see what policy experts come up with to try and avoid such a strict shutdown during any emergency down the road. That'll be an interesting thing to watch. The border restrictions created a lot of frustration at the state, provincial, and municipal levels, as many of you or most of you know. We've heard lots of concerns from lawmakers, business leaders, especially in industries like tourism, and of course, families that have been separated for a year and a half from loved ones on the other side. With Canada's move to ease back its measures, the pressure is now on the Biden administration to reciprocate, to follow Canada, I guess. And with the pressure, as you just mentioned, about resolutions coming, there's a recent example. Another resolution was passed just yesterday by the board of the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, calling on Congress to establish a Canada-U.S. commission to examine this border closure. So, as I said, I believe Edward will discuss more of this from the U.S. perspective in a few minutes. The The second theme I wanted to talk about is cross-border business, which is obviously critical to both sides, but much more critical to Canadians. The general sentiment is that since the arrival of Joe Biden as president, is that the tone at the top has been much more predictable and less combative than it was under Donald Trump. But many of the challenges are still very much around. Business leaders in Canada say its relationship with the US has been going well in areas, like climate, critical minerals, and even in maintaining the key supply chains and trade through the pandemic. But other areas have been trickier. For example, the prospect of incoming Buy America policies that affect Canadian business has been a major concern. Canadian Ambassador Kirsten Hillman recently told a webinar, it's very possible Ottawa would answer any punitive Buy America policies with Buy Canadian rules of its own. She also warned that reciprocal Canadian measures would hurt US companies and lead to job losses. She added that the matter is an incredibly topical question that officials are spending a lot of time on. So, as you know, for many states, Canada is their biggest export partner. I was also speaking last week with Canadian Infrastructure Minister Catherine McKenna, and she told me that she's always made the case to her US counterparts like this. Other than Canada, who else would you want to rely on when it comes to supply chains? Canadians, but also many Americans, have been urging the Biden administration to focus on a more North American supply chain or trade zone, a Buy North America, if you will. McKenna also said that she always brings up Buy America when she speaks with US officials. And, the prospect of protectionist US policies are clearly top of mind at the highest levels. Earlier this month, the Canadian readout of a call between Trudeau and Biden said the Prime Minister brought up the benefits of each country of open government procurement. So, other bilateral challenges have also been around for a long time, and they're still here. Things like the softwood lumber dispute and this ongoing pursuit of a new agreement. Dairy is another sticking point, an example of a long-running issue. Of course, the provincial and state ties are crucial, regardless of what happens between the Prime Minister's office and the White House. Provincial representatives are very active in the US at the state and national levels. For example, Quebec borders US states like New York, and there are huge opportunities. I had an exit interview with Catherine Loubier, Quebec's now former Delegate General to New York. She recently left the post, but before she left, she spoke of the economic links, including Quebec's hydroelectricity exports to New York City, that she pitched alongside the message of addressing climate change. So I wanted to just come to my third area, and this is looking forward a little bit and what's next in Canada-U.S. relations. So the two governments have talked up this bilateral roadmap that lays out many areas of collaboration. It was announced by President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau back in February. And many of the business groups I've talked to welcome the roadmap, but it remains to be seen how many of the commitments are actually fulfilled to really understand, to really see an impact. As I mentioned earlier, critical minerals are part of the roadmap, and indeed they keep coming up in many conversations. Canada has lots of them and the US wants them, and of course they have geopolitical significance. Canada and the US Critical Minerals Action Plan targets, according to the roadmap, a net zero industrial transformation, batteries for zero emissions vehicles, and renewable energy storage. So there's just a lot of opportunities, and it remains to be seen how that strategy and that action plan works and how much of them can be refined in Canada or how that will work. It's a very interesting topic to follow. In other areas of the roadmap, they range in commitments from strengthening Canada-U.S. supply chain security to expanding the U.S.-Canada Arctic dialogue. I recommend you read it and have a look at what's being examined. And just one other area I want to talk about the impact of the Biden administration is at the multilateral level, which is very important for a middle power country like Canada. Since coming to office, Biden has started working to rebuild global alliances. And one important example for Canada that's very urgent these days is China. And Ottawa has significant bilateral tensions with China over the 2018 arrest of senior Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou on a US extradition warrant. In an apparent retaliation, 9 days later, Chinese authorities arrested 2 Canadians for spying and resentenced another Canadian convicted of drug trafficking to death. The cases have been at the heart of Canada-China relations, and all eyes in Canada are on the Biden administration to see if if it can help resolve this standoff. And of course, even more urgent is we have a Canadian federal election now underway. Election day is set for September 20th. It's going to be interesting, especially with the pandemic still around. We saw yesterday's results in Nova Scotia. The Nova Scotia election can bring surprises. It's very unpredictable. And the importance of the US-Canada relationship and most, if not all of these issues I've been talking about will be critical for whichever party forms the next federal government. The relationship is just too important. So thanks again for having me. And of course, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Billy, if you mind presenting our next speaker.
Sure. Thank you, Andy. And you had a lot of great and interesting points there. Our next speaker is Edward Alden. He is the Bernard L. Schwartz Senior Fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations, specializing in U.S. economic competitiveness, trade, and immigration policy. Alden's previous book, The Closing of the American Border, Terrorism, Immigration, and Security Since 9/11, was a finalist for the Lucas Book Prize for narrative nonfiction in 2009. He is also the Ross Distinguished Visiting Professor at Western Washington University. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce Edward Ted Alden.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Jones, and it's good to be here. It's good to be here with Andy. Politico's reporting on these border issues has been superb, and thanks to David for the invitation. Even though it's early out here on the West Coast, I'm delighted to be with all of you. Western Washington is just north of Seattle on the beautiful West Coast here. I'm going to address this issue more from a U.S. perspective, though I have kept a pretty close eye on the developments in Canada as well. To me, the most striking thing about the border actions that Andy outlined has been, quite frankly, from a U.S. perspective, the indifference to what Canada happens to be doing. The degree of the lack of coordination has been surprising to me. This is such a stark contrast to the post 9/11 period. You were generous enough to mention my book about the aftermath of 9/11 in terms of U.S. border policies. And if you look at that time, cooperation between the United States and Canada was tremendously close and cooperative. Right after the fall of 2001, immediately following the 9/11 attacks, which resulted in a short border shutdown, not a lengthy one like we've seen. You had then President Bush's top Homeland Security advisor, Tom Ridge, sit down with Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister, later Deputy Prime Minister John Manley, to try to come up with cooperative ways to improve security at the border while not interfering with the world's largest trade relationship and the high volume of cross-border travel. If you look at many of the innovations we enjoy at the border today, they came out of this period. The Nexus program, which had just been a pilot, was expanded dramatically. The document requirements under the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, that's why we all carry passports at the US-Canada border now, which we never used to do. The Free and Secure Trade, the FAST program, and the CTPAT programs for cargo security, joint maritime enforcement in the Great Lakes. These all came out of that kind of 4-month period of intense cooperation and this very high level sense with both governments that whatever needed to be done to try to secure the border against future terrorist crossings, that the economic relationship, political relationship was so important that those measures could not interfere with that. With COVID, however, I have been so struck by the comparative lack of coordination since the original March 2020 joint announcement of the border closure. I mean, the governments did at the time, to be fair, have a loose framework and a clear understanding that trade would not be impeded. Even given that there were some dangers obviously associated with truckers moving back and forth across the border, the decision was made that that keeping those supply chains moving was vital, both to Canada and the United States. That would not be interfered with, nor would travel by essential workers, particularly nurses and doctors and others. And indeed, there have been very few disruptions in Canada-U.S. trade, which is a real accomplishment. But on the movement of people, the two governments have diverged far more sharply than I ever had imagined that they would. Just to give a few examples, Andy mentioned that the United States has never shut down air travel from Canada. I mean, until the recent moves by the Canadian government, Americans could not fly into Canada, but Canadians could fly into the United States. Results in a bizarre kind of situation where, say you've got a married couple, one living in Windsor and one living in Detroit. The only way to get from Windsor to Detroit is by flying there via Toronto, which last I checked was $844 round trip on Expedia, as opposed to a 20-minute, half-hour drive, depending on the border lineup. Second example, the initial border closure referred to recreational and tourist travel as non-essential. That makes sense to all of us, but left the issue of families and those in close relationships unaddressed. There was nothing in the initial announcements about families. Last October, Canada responded to the concerns of families. There's been a very active lobbying effort by family members in Canada. Canada responded to those concerns by offering an exemption to the restrictions for close family members, and even for those in committed relationships of a year or more, provided the Americans crossing the border abided by the quarantine requirements that were then in place for everyone, including Canadians. The United States has never reciprocated on that measure. There's no family exemption measure allowing Canadians to come here into the United States. Canada now has uniform testing requirements for Canadians and Americans at the border. The U.S. has no such regime in place. So just, personal example, my dual citizen sister and her husband were in Rhode Island earlier this month for their daughter's engagement. They ended up having to rebook their flights back to Vancouver because their COVID test did not come through in the required 72 hours. So it cost them $1,000 to rebook their flights back to Canada. I was in Vancouver and went to Toronto recently to visit my brother as well. I followed all of the testing requirements. I had the advanced test. Actually, I had to do a second test at the border because this was just before the full opening. But when I came back across the Peace Arch crossing a few days ago, I mean, it was the shortest encounter I ever had, right? The agent said, "Do you have anything to declare?" I said, "No, sir." And he said, "Have a nice day." So not a single health screening question coming back on the U.S. side. And now, of course, Canada has reopened the land border to vaccinated Americans. And as Andy said, we don't know if or when the U.S. is going to reciprocate. Those of us who've been working on this issue for a long time remain deeply puzzled by the U.S. actions. And there's some real costs on the U.S. side of the border. Just use the example out here of Point Roberts, which is an isolated community that you can only access via land through Canada. The economy of that Point Roberts has been devastated by the shutdown. And the recent moves are actually going to make it worse because Point Roberts depends on Canadian property owners and tourist traffic. Now, some Point Roberts residents can actually leave Point Roberts to go shopping in Canada. So the grocery store and the other services in Point Roberts are getting even less business. So why hasn't the U.S. reciprocated? There are three theories out there that I'll just go over quickly. The first, which is really important to remember, those of us who are so focused on the Canadian border, the U.S. has two borders, Canadian border and the Mexican border. And the initial shutdown was done simultaneously on both borders. And the Biden administration is clearly worried that it's going to face criticism if it reopens one border and not the other. I'm not saying that that's impossible. At the Penwar meeting, the Pacific Northwest meeting that was mentioned, Ted Sobel, who's the U.S. attaché in Canada for DHS, said that there was still a possibility that the U.S. would operate separately on the Canadian border. But there's a big debate in the administration. Do we have to go simultaneously? And if they open the Mexican border, what does that mean for the asylum crisis on that border? Currently, most asylum seekers arriving at the border with Mexico are being turned back immediately under a health law known as Title 42. If the U.S. reopens the Mexican border, says from a health perspective, we think it's safe to let people back in, what are they going to do about Title 42? And then are you going to see an even larger surge in asylum claims? Second possibility is that the U.S. wants to lift its travel restrictions in a more coordinated way with all countries, not just with Canada. I mean, Reuters reported a couple of weeks ago that an interagency working group is developing plans for the U.S. to reopen to vaccinated travelers from Europe and elsewhere. The Europeans, of course, have opened to a lot of American vaccinated travelers. The U.S. has not reciprocated that either. Very unclear on what the timing. A third possibility, which maybe concerns me even more than the first two, is that the United States simply has not done the preparatory work yet. I mean, those of us in the border community have been talking for months now about the need for the Canadian and U.S. governments to cooperate on the technicalities of border reopening. How are you going to determine that people are vaccinated? You know, what are the parameters of the rules going to be? Canada has done a fair bit of work. You've got the ArriveCan app that allows you to enter your vaccine and other information and creates a reasonably efficient screening, though there have been delays of border crossers. The U.S. has no sort of comparable system, hasn't put it in place, doesn't seem like it's going to necessarily borrow the ArriveCan app technology. Again, this was the sort of thing the two governments worked intimately on after 9/11, but this time they have gone their own way. I wish I had a crystal ball on when all this might change, but it does not appear to be a high priority for the Biden administration. I'll just close with a brief comment on the broader relationship. You know, if you look across the board, what the administration is doing on trade policy, which I follow very closely on supply chains. Andy mentioned critical minerals, but the Biden administration has a much broader supply chain strategy that includes, you know, semiconductors and medical equipment, pharmaceuticals. At the new Buy America rules, all of these, the administration is taking a very nationalist approach. There are a lot of, there's been a lot of continuation from the approach that the Trump administration took on this issue. There's a lot of talk about reshoring, about Buy America, about bolstering U.S. manufacturing, and it's not at all clear where Canada is going to fit into this. I very much, you know, support the notion of broader Buy North America policies, but I haven't heard anything out of the administration's trade and economic folks so far that suggests that they share that framework. So this is going to create, I think, some real challenges going forward for Canada. So let me stop there. I'd be happy to talk a bit about the state and provincial stuff as well, but obviously a lot of this is very much done at the federal level.
So, thank you very much, Ted, and thank you also, Andy. I think that I speak on behalf of everyone and who's with us today and saying that both presentations were very informative and helpful. And I may add that probably nothing will change before Election Day on September 20th, especially on the Canadian side, and the American will watch closely what's happening in Nova Scotia, but also what will happen in Ottawa. Now, I would like to start the discussion between you two and our members, but first, are there any other points that you would like to elaborate on and perhaps discuss the material that you present between the two of you? And we can go and ask David to moderate the Q&A discussion if it's possible.
Will do.
Okay. Is there anything you guys want to add?
I mean, I'd be interested in just taking questions and comments from your participants.
That makes sense to me. Yeah, we can take questions.
Well, since I just got appointed master of the Q&A, I'm going to start by saying, how much does the Canada election have? I mean, it's the Trudeau government just kind of putting things aside and just hoping that things will not change because they don't want to have any discussion on anything until the election. I mean, what Keith said, he doesn't expect anything to happen in Canada. Does the U.S. respect what's going on in Canada as far as the election goes and border?
I mean, let Andy start with what will happen on the Canadian side. I'll comment on the US side. Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I guess, what was your question about the Canadian side, about whether the US-Canada relationship at the prime ministerial level would kind of quiet down while the election
Or
is
just
on?
be on hold? Just,
Yeah.
I mean, I promised I wouldn't ask you to talk about election stuff, so.
Oh, no, it's fine.
Okay.
It's no problem at all. Yeah, it's funny. I was speaking to a couple of business leaders in Canada just yesterday about this kind of thing, and there is a sense that some things will be put on hold, but there's also, we know the relationship is very deep between the two countries at all the different government levels, and even from the embassy level, and Canada's embassy in Washington, of course, the ambassador. So I think the work will still continue, but yes, when it comes to that high level discussion, I think some of that, or perhaps all of it, will have to be put on hold. I mean, I don't see, Prime Minister Trudeau having regular phone calls with President Biden discussing these issues during an election campaign because of how that could, how that could be perceived. So yeah, I think a little bit will be put on hold. Yeah.
I mean, on the US side, I don't think US actions will be that affected by the Canadian election. I don't expect any surprises from this side that would be embarrassing to the Trudeau government. The Biden administration wouldn't want to do that. I mean, in terms of the border, we're facing, a deadline this Saturday for the rollover again, which has been, on the 21st of every month. Given the talk so far, I expect another straight rollover. So that throws it to September 21st, which is after the election. So I'm guessing we're not going to see significant U.S. border actions until after the election.
Anyone else, particularly those of you in border states? What's it been like where you are?
Well, I think as far as New Hampshire is concerned, we know that the opening of the border was a significant event. As I said, the 6 hours was the time in terms of the line of traffic waiting to get into Canada. And we've got a very deep-seated relationship with Canada. It's our trade is enormous between the state of New Hampshire and Canada, and that's been problematic, particularly in the lumber industry. And we ship lumber across, it's processed in Canada and then brought back. So that's been an item that's been of deep concern to people here in the state. But the tourism business that obviously very significant to us. The Canadians coming across to our beaches in New Hampshire and in Maine. I mean, both of those were severely curtailed as a result of the border situation. And we've got a vested interest in the United States being much more assertive and cooperative in terms of the border situation. And Ed, you look at it from our side, and I'm very concerned about the administration and sort of their sort of delayed interest. I know the problems that the administration's facing, and I'll say to you and to my colleagues, the president's a good friend of mine. I've known the president for a long period of time. I was one of his early supporters here in the state of New Hampshire. He's got his hands full. He's got his plate's pretty full, but indeed, I'd like you to comment about the Mexican-Canadian situation and how you think that's affecting the decision-making process.
Thanks. That's a great question. I mean, I do think it's had a significant effect in two dimensions. One is the one that I mentioned in my overview, which I think there is a desire by the administration to act simultaneously on both borders. And the Mexican border is much more complicated for obvious reasons. I mean, from a Canadian perspective, this is a bad thing, right? I mean, one of Canada's long-standing points to the United States, and you saw this very much after 9/11, is the Canadian border needs to be treated differently than the Mexican border. And so I think this is not in Canada's interest to see the US treating the two borders in a more identical kind of way. So that's one thing. The other thing I think is just the bandwidth for the Department of Homeland Security and their new secretary, Alden Mayorkas, who I actually know quite well. The challenges at the southern border are so enormous in terms of trying to deal with the volume of asylum claims and other issues. I think Secretary Mayorkas has been spending almost every minute on that. Now, of course, he's going to have to deal also with the Afghan refugee situation. And I think there has just not been the personnel and bandwidth in the Department of Homeland Security to focus on this. He hasn't put anybody at a high level in charge of the Canada file. It's being dealt with by very low level officials. And I think if DHS doesn't drive this, it's not going to happen. There's nowhere else in the administration where the border issues are going to be handled. David, could I just actually make one comment while I'm thinking about it that's very relevant for the states? Mr. Alessandro was talking about people in New Hampshire going up to Canada. One of the issues that I think is going to be a big one for the next year is this question of testing. And the states can make a big difference on that, right? Currently, you need a PCR test to go to Canada. I think when the US reopens its border, maybe the same thing. The PCR tests are expensive. Most insurance companies won't pay for them. I can afford to pay $150 for a test to go to Canada and go to a place where I know I'm going to get timely results. A lot of people may not be able to do that, right? You're going to be barring border crossing to people of modest means because they can't afford the costs of testing. So it's something that I think would be worth the states and provinces looking into, to the extent that we want to encourage more cross-border travel. And I think for the foreseeable future, testing is going to be part of this. What can the states and provinces do to make those tests more timely, so that you don't run into the 72-hour problem, and be more affordable for your citizens? So I know that wasn't directly related to the question, but I think the comment about how important the back and forth is for New Hampshire and obviously for Quebec and other places in Canada.
No, but it's a great question, and thanks for bringing it up. I'm going to turn over to Senator Clarkson from Vermont.
Thanks. Lou, of course, articulated much of Vermont's concern as well. I guess I'd ask Ted and Andy what we can do as legislators to front burner our federal action. I mean, a resolution, as much as I support probably the resolutions we're going to do, may not have much impact. To think that tourism is a non-essential trade piece is, to me, a joke, given how dependent Maine, Vermont, New York, New Hampshire, all the border states, how dependent we are on a whole segment of our economy is dependent on that cross-border flow. And so I guess I'd ask you, what could we as legislators do that you think would effectively impact Homeland Security and our federal delegations?
Well, I wish I had a really good answer to that, because I have been surprised by the lack of response to the pressure that's been there. I mean, the Senate Majority Leader Schumer has talked about this on several occasions, made it clear he's not happy with the current border closure, and that hasn't got through to the administration despite his enormous influence in Washington. I would think that some targeted pressure on Homeland Security might be helpful. Make it very clear to DHS the costs that U.S. states are facing for this continued shutdown. That's where the initiative is going to come from, I think. But I unfortunately, the administration just has not been paying attention to the pressure that's coming from federal lawmakers. You look at Representatives Higgins and Jacobs in New York State, who've made this a big issue. Nobody in Washington seems to be responding. So So I don't know, except to say more and more determined, but at the moment they don't really seem to be listening, I'm afraid.
Well,
I have a,
yeah, no, I think just to follow up, I think that the cost, clarifying the cost to all of us would be
I do.
really important. And I think every one of our states could do that. And how we are organized as a united border community, I actually don't know. I know we have the Northern Border Commission, which could help us. And I know there's another commission like it in the West, I believe. I don't know what's in the Midwest, but that's a great idea. And maybe looping the those commissions into helping us make the case would be productive.
I'm going to put in the chat here a good resource for you, which is the Border Policy Research Institute at my university here, which is run by Lori Troutman, who some of you I'm sure know.
excellent.
Has produced a wonderful new report. It actually got delayed for a few months for reasons I probably can't share, having to do with one of the two governments. But it's a fairly comprehensive look at the economic impacts of the border shutdown across all the regions of the northern border. So I will put that. She was just able to release it about 10 days ago. I will put that in the chat, and if you're looking for evidence on economic impacts, it's a very useful tool.
I mean, the BPRI has some really good reports, not just this one, but others, and I would recommend that you take a look at them. Andy, I'm not ignoring you, but I want to ask Ted one more question on DHS. We're only 7 months into this administration, and I know the bureaucracy in Washington lost a lot of people over the last administration. Is DHS still far behind, as say state was and others?
Yeah, I mean, they have been slow to fill the major positions. I mean, Congress has been slow in, or the Senate, excuse me, has been slow in confirming nominees in all of the departments. And as I say, from the Canada perspective, there's no point person on the relationship. I mean, there's nobody comparable to the role that Alan Burson played in the Obama administration, for instance. So I think, a lot of the concern, and Lori's at the Penwar discussions this week, and we've been going back and forth a little bit. I think a lot of the concern here is that the state legislators and the really don't know who to talk to in the federal government. Normally there's somebody in DHS for whom the U.S.-Canada border issue is the top priority. There's nobody there now. So if you're having to go directly to the secretary, he's very focused on the southern border. So it's been hard to get through.
Andy, to go back to what we just raised about testing in the United States, what's testing like in Canada, and do Canadians face the same financial and time constrictions that Americans do?
That's a good question. I think it depends what the circumstances are. I don't know for sure about everywhere if Canadians are always paying for it, but I think a lot of it is covered up here. I don't know how to compare it to what's going on in the United States, but yeah, I guess I don't know a whole lot about the testing situation in Canada, but I know some of it is definitely covered.
I actually don't think it's covered for travel. Just looking at my family's experience, it's covered for health reasons, and I mean, again, I'm not saying that's inappropriate necessarily. Obviously, the main goal of testing is to prevent the spread of COVID, and you want to cover it for health reasons. But to the extent that testing is going to become part of the new post-COVID travel regime, and I think it probably is, do we want to force people to pay for that out of pocket? In which case, we limit border travel to people who've got, $150, or if you're a family of four, $600 to spare. I think that's going to be a not insignificant limiting factor in cross-border travel going forward.
On this, I'm going to pick on my colleague Shirley Girouard, who chairs our health committee. Shirley's also a nurse and has extensive experience in policy and in medicine and health. Just to sort of weigh in on this a little bit. Shirley, do you mind? I'm not picking on you, but you're a smart person.
Thank you. I don't know how smart I am, but I certainly followed this issue pretty closely based on the fact that I'm so frustrated not being able to travel myself. In fact, I just put into the chat box a question about why not use proof of vaccine instead. you know, it's not 100%, but it's 80%. And the thing about the testing is that it tells you that point in time, but it tells you what's going to happen 2 days later or 3 days later. So to me, it would make more sense to use proof of vaccine. Now that would, I mean, on the positive side, from my perspective, is that would encourage a lot of people to get vaccines so that they could do things. I mean, we've been doing that to allow people into theaters in New York City, and to restaurants, and other people are adopting that model. So I was wondering why that wasn't considered.
Both.
It's both, yeah.
It's both.
Yeah.
It's both fully vaccinated and testing. And,
Yeah,
and just to put in a point, I think Edward brought it up here. We're running into that issue here with the testing. Now that a lot of the free state testing sites have gone away because, quite frankly, 2 to 3 months ago, you could have gone anywhere for a test I mean, there were some limitations, but for any given reason, quite honestly. But now that when the governor took the restrictions off, he took away a lot of the free state testing sites, and we're running into that issue as well. A lot to do with, you know, people having to, you know, for family reasons. And, you know, it's not, if we keep these testing requirements in place and we don't offer free testing, that is going to limit border travel. I agree with Edward 100% on that, because it's not going to be like Billy Jones and his family are going to go over to Quebec or Ontario for a nice little weekend away, or you know, to go up there and get some of that great poutine that we like here. And you know, there's just going to be limitations on that. So we're looking at the long-term effects of this. It's not going to be cross-border travel as we know it, and it's not going to have our, you know, our friends and neighbors to the north come down here for a day of shopping, for a day of, you know, tourism. So that is really, really going to affect us if these testing mandates stay in place and we don't have free testing. I do agree on that.
That's why vaccine proof seems to make so much more sense, both practically and clinically too.
Yes.
Sorry, can I just say one thing on this? And this, I actually think this is very much a political question and very relevant to all of you. The question is, what's our risk tolerance, right? I mean, the argument for testing would be that some vaccinated people get COVID, and it appears that an asymptomatic vaccinated person could potentially spread COVID, particularly to an unvaccinated person. So the question is, do you consider full vaccine enough protection? It's not 100%, right? It's maybe 95, and vaccinated people are obviously much safer than unvaccinated people, but it's not foolproof. And so the Canadian position at the moment, I mean, the original Canadian was full vaccine plus 72-hour test plus another test after you arrived. That was the pre-August 9th scenario for those who could go. And I was able to go because our daughter lives there, so I have that connection. Now they're back to one test, but if you eliminate the test, then you do raise the risk a little bit, right? That somebody who's fully vaccinated but asymptomatic affected could come into Canada and potentially give it to someone else. So those are difficult questions, right? I mean, they're, you know, what's our risk tolerance in all of this? And at the end of the day, that's not just a health expert question; it's a political question.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
Just on vaccine certification, it hasn't really blown up into a big issue right now, but there have been questions in Canada about, you know, Americans that are getting vaccinated at their, you know, in their local state, and they have a vaccination record, but whether those could be falsified. And I think there's been a couple of news stories about that, but that's an issue about whatever they're uploading to this Arrive Canada app. How do we know whether the original document truly, you know, whether they're truly vaccinated? I don't know if that would become a big problem, but it's something people have definitely brought up here as well.
And there have been issues about the vaccines too. Didn't New York's theater district wasn't recognizing the AstraZeneca vaccine for entry, and a lot of Canadians have had the AstraZeneca vaccine. So there are a lot of issues here.
Yep. No, that's a big one too.
It's the reason why it's so political. And
I suggest that we should restrict people from leaving some of the states in the United States to go to other states, which we're not doing.
I mean, again, that was done early on in the pandemic, but
Yeah,
all that's been
yeah.
lifted, right? Same in
Yeah.
Canada. I mean, you had
Yeah. Yeah, the risk is really high for people coming from Alabama and Texas and Florida, and they're traveling freely into other states. I mean, it's so nuts. We have in New Haven a restriction that everyone has to be masked indoors, and 2 towns over, we don't. So it's like people don't go from New Haven to Branford, Connecticut. You know, the whole thing has gotten so mixed up. So people just need to sit down and sort of sort out what do they really want to accomplish through the policy. And that's the only way we'll be able to first tackle the whole pandemic, but to bring some sanity to what we're trying to do.
Right, and surely the patchwork of regulation is really useless, and asking people who aren't vaccinated to mask up is a joke, because you're asking that population who are already a little rogue to actually do something for other people. It's like
yeah. It's, you know, we didn't have this problem with polio. Maybe we should look back and how do we do that?
And we didn't have this problem in 1918. So it's like, really? What? Well, we know how it got.
There wasn't a vaccine then. So, yeah.
Well, Billy brings up some really good points about the border, the instant just pop across the border to go to Costco, or to have dinner in the other country. That's going to be a big problem. I wanted to take it to in the last couple of minutes we have before we get into the resolutions, and so to tee up. To go back to what Andy raised earlier, the perennial issue of softwood is just is this the same old, just throwing another monkey wrench into the works to take care of inefficient American lumber producers, or is there something more to it? And the other thing is, yesterday, those of you who are tuned in to yesterday's noon plenary session with Tony Seba, was very, very interesting. He's a futurist, and he was basically looking to the end of the dairy industry as we know it within 10 years. Basically, it's toast, because most of the stuff that dairy products, and not milk and regular cheese, but also cheese, but the stuff that comes from dairy that you put in all sorts of things can be done in a lab, and it's just not going to be an issue. We're going to have to move on. So how's that going to affect Canada-U.S. relations and dairy? Because that's one of those big things right now.
Hoping Edward will be able to bail me out on this a little bit, but it's so I'm not an expert in dairy or softwood, but I mean, the way it's described to me is that, I mean, these are longstanding issues. They flare up from time to time. There's, for example, for softwood, there's still this interest, strong interest on the Canadian side to negotiate a new agreement. It's sort of mixed in now with the increase in prices, so I think that's added a layer to what's going on. But historically speaking, about how it differs from the past, it's tough for me to say. But and for dairy, I think it's similar. I think it's just another issue that we've seen between the countries for a long time. Canada has the supply managed sector, and that with quotas, and it's obviously raised concerns. And we've had USMCA and how that the whole negotiations with that, it was such a topic of discussion. But into the sort of nuts and bolts of where each of those issues are, that's something I don't have as a good a view on, to be honest.
Okay. I mean, the only thing I would add, Dave and Andy, is I have seen, and I've kind of watched softwood lumber on and off for longer than I care to admit, as I know you have too, David. I see less willingness. I mean, this has been an on again, off again fight, and same with dairy. What I do though is I see less willingness by the two governments to come to negotiated resolutions. I mean, it's quite stunning on softwood lumber, given what's happened to lumber prices, that you wouldn't have seen a serious effort to say, look, we just got to get past this, right? Lumber prices are going crazy anyway. To add, 20 or 25% or whatever the current duty is on top of that. I mean, it's not that high. It might be 12 now. But to add the tariff on top of that is just harming U.S. home builders. And it's time to reach a deal and move past it. Didn't do that, right? The softwood lumber producers like the duty being in place here in the United States, and the government doesn't seem to be willing to push back. On dairy, again, the U.S. has jumped immediately into using the dispute provisions under the new USMCA rather than trying to negotiate a resolution, and it has been reasonably belligerent about it, quite upfront about saying, we're enforcing our rights under the USMCA and Canada's not playing by the rules. And just the tone of it to me is more confrontational than what I remember in the past, where it was a bit more of an ebb and flow of periods of confrontation and periods of cooperation. We've had this confrontational tone from the Trump administration carried over into the new administration. I hope it quiets down, but again, where I finished my comments, and I think Andy had some similar things to say. There's a lot of nationalism on both sides of the border, and that makes it harder to cooperate, because the politically easy thing to do is to play the flag waving card and say, we're standing up for American interests, or we're standing up for Canadian interests. And that, I think, is unfortunately the moment we're in the relationship right now. And I think, getting back to the states provinces piece, that's a role that you all have to play, I think, in trying to tamp that down, in constantly reminding not just your constituents, but the broader country of the importance of the economic relationship, the cultural ties across the US-Canadian border, and that neither of us wins when we spend a lot of time waving the flag.
Do you think Canadian nationalism kind of amped up during the last administration?
Oh, enormously. I mean, and the Canadians will tell you that it was, I mean, I'm just, I wrote a piece that got published. It was perhaps ill-timed in April in the Globe and Mail, calling for cooperation on border reopening. I got, 900 comments telling, me that I was an ignorant American and I should stay where I belong, and who am I to, give any advice to the Canadians. And the Canadians are, they're pretty frank about this. They were, they were pretty horrified by the Trump administration, and one of the responses was to really focus on keeping Canada separate from that, and we're Canadians and we're not any part of that, and this is what it means to be. I mean, throughout the border stuff, out here in British Columbia, right? I mean, the Premier John Horgan was reasonably ugly about it, right? Americans should stay out, and at one point, there were some American cars that got keyed, and his response was, well, if they're going to come up here, they should ride bicycles. And there was a lot of, it's just stuff I'd never seen before in the Canada-U.S. relationship. And I hope that we, COVID's made us all a little crazy. I hope we will move past this, but I do, look at history, right? Once nationalisms get going, they can deepen in destructive ways. Even in U.S. and Canada are not immune from that, right? I think we're more immune from it than most relationships, but we're not entirely immune from it.
Well, this is a good tee up for the resolutions, but I did want to give Andy the last word on the discussion.
Yeah, no, I think Edward caught it nicely. I mean, with the nationalism, it was recently during the pandemic, it was, Canadians like to find things to look at Americans and say, like, hey, we're better than you. That occasionally happens. So I think as things were difficult in the US during the pandemic, and perhaps better in Canada, there was a sentiment of well, we don't want Americans up here, especially before the vaccinations began, like we just don't want them here. I think that's changed a lot. I think, at least in terms of the border, I think a lot of Canadians are much more open to Americans coming up. Even premiers are open to it, as long as people are fully vaccinated. But I think there was it did cause quite a reaction in Canada for sure. But it seems like it's cooling down a little bit, at least for now.
Good, well, thank you. So I'm going to turn it over to our co-chairs now for the two resolutions. I think we've teed up the background on it. We do have a hard stop at 11:30. One of our chairs has to leave. So Guy, over to you.
Thank you, David. We will have a short business session. You probably received the two resolutions that we will introduce. There's one that I draft regarding Canada-U.S. border reopening. Would it possible for David or Jack to put it on the screen or in the chat?
It is in the chat.
Okay. I hope that everybody had a piece on it, or do I have to read it, David?
I don't think so, but I mean, unless folks want it read. Let me see if I can share my screen. I don't.
try to do it. Oh, but like all of your comment, we also have discussion these days regarding the proof of vaccine, either in Quebec and Ontario. Okay, that's the second one. Can we put the first?
Absolutely.
That Molly's resolution.
No. I'm.
Oh, we may stop by this one.
Yeah, and David sent them all. So if people just want to access their emails from yesterday, David sent.
Right, and I've got a great team behind the scenes here. Eve and Allison, and frankly, I've not learned everything I'm supposed to do on this, but they've been great. And I haven't, so hold on. Look at what you've got.
They can just click on to them in the chat.
Yeah. Here we go.
And the first one we're going to do is the full reopening.
Yes,
Yes.
the first one is for reopening and simplify also the proceeding between the two countries.
Here we go.
Okay. So that's the first one regarding the reopening of United States-Canada border to fully vaccinated individual. Do we have any?
The issue here is the ArriveCan portal going for U.S. citizens going to Canada, and then there's sort of our usual $1 trillion in trade, direct investment, and all the other stuff that we put in past resolutions. And a lot of this talks about what we've done today. But we talk about CDC and Canada's Expert Advisory Committee, but then go to the resolve clauses that the federal government of the United States fully reopened the border to all fully vaccinated individuals immediately, which we've discussed. That Canada simplify the ArriveCan entry process for fully vaccinated citizens. I've heard that's been a challenge. That the governments reciprocate with swift and simple entry process for fully vaccinated individuals once the border is reopened to Canadians. And that, as usual, we submit this to provincial and state and federal authorities. Keith?
Yes, do we have any discussion on the resolution or any comments? No, do we have a move? Yeah,
I move we approve it.
Is that Senator Pacheco?
How are you, my friend?
Okay,
Yeah, and I would
Yes,
second
it
it.
is.
I'm happy to second it.
okay. So
Okay.
members can vote, not visitors, but all
Not
in
visitors?
no, we love our visitors, but they're not officially part of the committee, and this is a committee resolution that will be passed on to the co-executive committee on Friday.
Okay, all those in favor say yay.
Aye.
Aye.
Those against say nay. Okay, the resolution is then adopted. So we have another one, resolution 2021-02 by Molly Ryan.
Right.
It will be on the screen in 2 seconds.
2 seconds when David can figure it out. So Billy, why don't you talk about that?
Yes, and I thank Guy for giving Molly Ryan, my chief of staff, credit, but it just simply says that a resolution supporting free and open procurement policies between the United States and Canada. And I would point to this couldn't have been set up any better by me than the discussion that Edward put forth and Andy put forth here in the past half an hour or so. You know, I think it's important now more than ever that we have something in place in saying how important we are to each other in trade and in commerce and in working with each other, and that, you know, we build on relationships between each other. And a lot of the times you know, we are fighting back against, you know, China and other countries together on their, you know, on the inequity of trading policies. And I think this just does does put forth that in a united statement that CSGE supports free and open procurement policies between the United States and Canada, that the United States work with Canada to keep respective government procurement markets open to each other, that both countries avoid measures that can constrain a sustainable economic recovery. So the resolution is there. I hope that you have all read it, and I hope we can move forward.
So same procedure. Members can vote. And Billy, since you're a co-chair, I'm not going to ask you to do this. I'm just staff. So you can just conduct a vote. I mean,
Do I have a motion?
Yeah, he needs a motion. I would resolution is presented.
I have a
I'd be happy to
motion by
second.
Senator Clarkson and a second by Pacheco, Mr. Pacheco, I believe.
Nico?
Senator Pacheco, yes.
Pacheco.
Okay.
If I'm on the committee, David.
You
I
are.
think so. All right, yes.
Is there any further discussion? I see none, David. Do you?
Nope.
All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Didn't. Oh,
I believe none opposed. The resolution carries. Thank you very
Great.
much.
Thanks.
I was just going to say that in presenting these to our federal delegations and to wherever they go, maybe they should be presented in person to the head of Homeland Security. Maybe we should do a sit-in.
Or we could just do a visit, Allison, before we do the sit-in.
Yeah, we present and then maybe just not leave.
But it might be a good idea also to put those resolution on our social media.
Yeah, we
Just
will
to-
definitely do that. Now that we have a communications person on CSGE staff. One more thing, if there's anything on your minds that we should be looking at over the next year, speak up or let me know, or let our M&A Willette or Assemblyman Jones know. We've got a lot in front of us. So I suppose the first thing is to wait till September 21st, because then we'll have had the Canadian election. Thanks, Andy, for filling us in on that. And then the 21st to see whether the US government does anything. And then I guess it's either the same old world or a new world.
I guess, David, if I could speak here for a minute in saying, and I thought Andy and Edward brought up a lot of excellent points along with the border. And the question came up, what can we do as state representatives? And part of the answers were, well, I would only encourage that we come together and pinpoint in on the Homeland Security or the Homeland Security Department, because as was mentioned, we had Chuck Schumer. I know Gary knows this. We've had he actually invited him here. We had Chuck Schumer right in our backyards, the Senate Majority Leader, calling for the border to reopen, and it doesn't seem. And I will say, as much as I support this administration, I am disappointed in the lack of attention, I guess, that the northern border is getting. So I would say, people ask me that, well, what are you doing? What are you doing? Well, we're doing a lot. We're writing our ambassadors. We're pushing people. We're getting people here. We're forming coalitions like CSG East here to make our voice heard. And I just encourage us to keep doing that, and maybe pinpoint, if we can just pinpoint on to one thing. The Secretary of Homeland Security, and somebody brought up maybe the economic impact along the border, or the, you know, that this is having. I think those are all good ideas, and I would just encourage my colleagues. I know it's very important to both sides of the border here that we keep on this, and I thank you all for your support on both these resolutions today.
So maybe to follow up on that point, maybe we should meet in early October. Once the Canadian election is done, it would be great if we might meet as a committee and actually take some action on some of that.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yes.
We also have discussion on the proof of vaccine at our provincial level, both Ontario and Quebec. We will start a committee on that on the Quebec side starting next week. And it's a topic of our electoral campaign right now. So we may push on our provincial level to get the federal level be committed on especially on that action. But we will do the best we can. Keep in mind that Quebec and Ontario is 2/3 of the country. So
Really?
it's a big power, and for now on, Nova Scotia with their new conservative government last night, I think it will be helpful also for Ontario, and it's good for us to be catch in between. Before leaving us, just have to tell you that Catherine Loubier was replaced. We have a new délégué général in New York by the name of Martine Hébert. She was formerly in Chicago. She's now, she will take office in New York City. And she might be very helpful for those of you for any of your needs. She's very good. She's as good as Marie-Claude Francoeur in Boston. So imagine how good she is. So thanks again, everyone. And another special thanks to our two speakers for sharing their insight with us. We're very lucky to have two experts like Andy Blatchford and Ted Alden to help us make sense of what's going on in the relation between our two countries and between our states and provinces. A big thank also to CSGEs and their staff. David and your staff, you have put all this together for us in the easy way. I hope to see you all again in another meeting in this annual assembly. I leave now, Ted, your break is finished. You will take over for the rest of the conference, and you're doing a great job, my friend. So hope to see you soon. Stay healthy, and it's a deal, Billy. The first time we will be able to do it, we'll take a coffee. We don't have the same kind of land that they have in BC, have a zone that they can go without crossing the border, but maybe in Malone some way, or in Akwesasne.
Sounds like a deal, Guy. I look forward to it. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Hey, nice to see everybody, at least virtually. Good.
We're here.